Good morning, everybody, given that it's good afternoon. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's great to have so many people with us. And for those of you who aren't familiar with us, AHS is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy, national security fields, imbued with a Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We're on over 50 college campuses across the country, host a bevy of national programs here in Washington, D.C., and ultimately hope to get these students of ours working in the foreign policy, national security field, including at places like the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And with that, it's actually a great opportunity to welcome, to introduce a friend, really someone that I hope everybody's quite familiar with already, Jonathan Schanzer. Dr. Schanzer is the Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, which is a big national security and foreign policy think tank here in Washington. He's a prolific writer on a variety of Middle Eastern issues, but I think his real expertise, and it's the topic of his, I think, really third book, I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong, third book on the issue, which is really Palestinian politics and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so today we're here to discuss his latest book, Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War, which goes through what actually happened about a year ago. But most importantly, and I think that's where our conversation, I hope, will take us, is sort of why did it happen? Why will it probably happen again? And where do we stand with all the various regional dynamics that played out in that kind of mini conflict in that vein? So before I begin, as usual, we'll take a couple questions at the end. And to do that, just submit your questions through the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. And when we turn to that, I'll unmute you and you'll get your asked questions directly. So Jonathan, thanks for being with us. I really appreciate it. It's a great book, was a great read. Maybe we can just start off almost like as a refresher for all of us, because this little war was 9 months ago, 10 months ago, but at the same time, it seems like a lot's happened in the world since then. And so it's easy to kind of have overlooked it. So maybe you can just kind of walk us through relatively quickly, how did this war between Hamas and Israel start? What actually happened, kind of the pace of operations, and how did it actually end?
Sure. Well, first of all, Gabe, thank you for having me. Great to be with everybody here at the Alexander Hamilton Society. Really appreciate the work that you do and appreciate your friendship over the years. I'll just say this, that the book was something that I didn't plan to write. But certainly I felt the need to after watching this war unfold over the course of 11 days. And really the primary reason was the poor coverage that we saw here, the lack of understanding, the lack of depth by the analysts in DC as well as the journalists. And I just felt like it was important to add some of the context and to get perhaps beneath the headlines a bit. And that was really the purpose. The war itself was 11 days in May of last year. It was the result of, in my view, a decision made by the Palestinian Authority, urged by the United States and Israel and perhaps other countries as well, to cancel planned elections in April, the previous month. There were a lot of people that blamed it on a real estate dispute in East Jerusalem, where there was a court case that was winding its way through the Israeli court system, where it was possible that we would see the eviction of a number of Arab Israelis from their homes after a several decades long dispute that actually stemmed from Jewish families that had bought the homes in question, were kicked out of the territory after the 1948-49 War of Independence. And they, after Israel reclaimed this territory in 1967, that's when the court case began. I'm not sure that really was, in fact, the reason for it at all. I think really it does track back to the Palestinian political scene and Hamas being deeply frustrated by the fact that it was being excluded from elections. And by the way, I would note for good reason, given that it's a terrorist organization, and its inclusion in a future government would have prompted a cut in funding from the United States and a cut in recognition from the United States, and perhaps a broader political crisis that could have rocked the Middle East. At any rate, the Hamas terrorist organization decided to use the real estate dispute in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of East Jerusalem as their reason for launching rockets to the environs of Jerusalem. That began on May 10th, I believe, was the beginning of the conflict. The first couple of days saw a significant increase in the numbers of rockets fired by Hamas. You have to remember that over the years, these wars have happened on multiple occasions. This was in fact the fourth Gaza war since 2009. But the numbers of rockets have only increased over time, and the numbers that they're able to fire off in one salvo have increased over time. In all, over the 11 days of war, more than 4,000 rockets were fired out of the Gaza Strip, not all by Hamas, but mostly by Hamas, some by Palestinian Islamic Jihad, some by the Popular Resistance Committees and other terrorist organizations, smaller ones, admittedly, but operating under the watchful eye of Hamas, which is effectively the sovereign in the Gaza Strip. And the Israelis, of course, responded by first knocking down the vast majority of the rockets that were fired into Israeli airspace. This is due to the efficacy of the missile defense system known as Iron Dome. This is a short-range system that is truly remarkable in its ability to intercept these projectiles midair by tracking their trajectory and speed and height. They're able to knock out 90 to 95% of them, according to the best estimates that we have. And so the Israeli public remained largely safe during this war. Terrorized as they may have been, they were able to escape with minimal casualties. But in response, of course, the Israelis fired back at Hamas. They utilized what is commonly known as a target bank. These are targets that have been pre-approved well in advance of any conflict. The IDF secures a legal ruling from their Ministry of Justice and from their own lawyers within the military well in advance as they track the rockets and other weaponry that have been either built or smuggled into the Gaza Strip. And so the Israelis responded with overwhelming force in an attempt to shut down these rocket salvos. By some estimates, it was 2 or even 3 times the total number of munitions fired back in response. So entered between 8 and 12,000 shots back into the Gaza Strip. The end result, you would imagine that this would have been a horrific bloodbath. It was actually remarkable that there were roughly 250 people that were killed during the 11 days of conflict, with all of the rockets and munitions flying back and forth. This is, I think, a testament to Israel's surgical abilities. In other words, the precision that they have, precision-guided munitions and the like, that actually really helped, I think, minimize the conflict. Of course, the Israelis came under significant pressure from the international community, from the human rights NGO community, and certainly from the Palestinians themselves. With about 48 hours left in the conflict, Egypt was able to successfully secure a ceasefire, but it was not going to come into effect for another 48 hours. And so we saw a trailing off of the firing from both sides. But I think with the resignation that this thing was going to come to an end, just as the previous 3 conflicts had, and really without much of a solution. In other words, Hamas still controls the Gaza Strip. They continue to amass rockets. They continue to declare that their goal is to destroy the state of Israel. Israel continues to track and amass those targets for their target bank. And I would say that a 5th round of war in Gaza is almost inevitable based on what I've seen.
So that was a really great kind of overview. So I want to dive deeper into kind of Hamas's motivations. Now, as you said, it's a genocidal terrorist organization, and so I think trying to ask, well, what was it trying to achieve? Killing Jews is a pretty easy answer. But the way you started your answer was that it was sparked by the fact that its kind of great rival, the Palestinian Authority, had canceled elections. So what was its intended objective in doing this? Was it that it thought it actually could win these elections in the West Bank, and as a consequence, gain more power and thus upset that those had been canceled? Was it trying to embarrass the Palestinian Authority and claim some sort of more, kind of legitimacy, let's say, in the eyes of its own people? Obviously, in the book, you talk about how the fact that Israel had no real government at the time. It had just kind of gone through its fourth round of inconclusive elections, and so again was a little ham-fisted. What in your minds were Hamas's real goals for the conflict, and in your mind, do you think they were achieved?
So to answer that question, I'm going to just take you back in history for, if you'll indulge me for 30 seconds. You have to remember that Hamas has been stymied multiple times in the political realm. The first time that happened was shortly after its inception in the late 1980s. It was really the primary driver of the first Intifada. If you recall, this was kind of the organic uprising against Israel that began in December 1987 and really lasted till probably 1991, 1992. Really, at the time, Hamas thought that it was the leader of the Palestinians. They were the only ones on the ground. The PLO was in exile in Tunisia, if you recall. And that's when Yasser Arafat decided that he was going to launch the Oslo process with the Israelis, that peace process that began. But in doing so, he kind of leapfrogged Hamas. And that was the first moment that Hamas was really infuriated by the Palestinian Authority, and it set off this rivalry, if you will. For the years that followed, Hamas, I think gained a reputation for suicide bombings and brutal acts of violence. I think that the primary explanation that we saw here in the West was that they were trying to kill as many Jews, as many Israelis as possible. I think that's true, but they were also trying to undermine the peace process itself and to undermine the PLO. And this is, I think, the ongoing sort of dynamic that we see even to this day. Now, things really boiled to a head in 2006. Hamas took part in elections that year, and they were projected to lose. But in a surprise turn of events, they actually won those elections. They won the right to form a government. It was at that point that the US and the Israelis and others in the international community really persuaded the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, to block them from forming a government. It's at that point that Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip by force in 2007. It was a civil war. Most people don't think about the fact that the Palestinians have endured a civil war, but in fact they have. And so this was the dynamic. At the end of that war, Hamas gained full control over the Gaza Strip. The West Bank was, let's just say, tenuously within the grip of the PLO, of the Palestinian Authority. But we are now in a situation where you've got kind of two different Palestinian statelets under two different leaderships, two different systems of governance, two different economies, patrons, you name it, right? As Aaron David Miller says, it's the Noah's Ark of the Middle East. You've got two of everything, right? And so that's the dynamic leading up to the April elections, or the planned elections. And Hamas, I think, saw an opportunity to take part again. And at the end of the day, that opportunity was, they were deprived of that opportunity for the right reasons. Again, if Hamas won, it would have been a disaster. By the way, even if they just won a couple of seats, it would have been a disaster. It would have led to a full-on crisis between the Palestinians and Israel, between the Palestinians and the United States. This would have not been sustainable. So when the elections were canceled, it's my view that Hamas was looking for a way to demonstrate its leadership, to try to win the hearts and minds of the Palestinian population that it could not convince to support them in elections because they had lost the opportunity. So what do you do if you're a violent, Iran-backed terrorist organization that has just lost the ability to win hearts and minds through an election? You choose violence. And that's exactly what they did. They began to fire rockets. They did this in an attempt to demonstrate that they were the leaders of the Palestinians, that they were defending Jerusalem, they were defending the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that they're defending Islam. And, I think, as you ask, did they achieve that? I think the answer is yes. I think that they took the spotlight from the PA. In fact, if you look today at efforts by the United States and even Israel right now, the goal appears to be to try to provide additional legitimacy and to provide additional support to the Palestinian Authority. There is significant concern that they were weakened that Hamas looks stronger as a result of that May conflict. And so they're doing everything they can right now to identify ways to bolster the PA's legitimacy, to bolster its means of governance, to bolster security. All of these things are in process right now. And it all tracks back to Hamas's decision to wage that war. And I think, look, I don't put a lot of stock in the polls that we see coming out of the Middle East. If you're a Palestinian and somebody gets on the phone and says, do you support Hamas? I think the answer is usually going to be yes, I absolutely do, especially if you live in the Gaza Strip. But our sense is that they have grown stronger as a result of that war. And so there are efforts underway to try to weaken it again.
So let's stay on the Palestinian question for a minute. And then I want to turn to kind of questions about US policy, among others. So the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, is pushing 90. He's been in power for, as you said, I think 17 years now. Far longer actually than Yasser Arafat was as president of the Palestinian Authority, right? The discussion we're having now, that last bit that you just finished about the popularity of the PA, these kind of dual nature between that and the Hamas regime. This is a conversation we could have had 5 years ago. It's a conversation we could have had 5 years for that. There isn't a lot of movement there. So what do you see 5 years from now? I mean, the man is not immortal. Is he going to, pass away peacefully in office and it's a free for all and you can actually have a political vacuum that is filled by Hamas? What is your analysis of what the Israeli view is on things? My sense is there's sort of this, bipolar reaction sometimes, which is some Israeli leaders will say, he's just as bad as Hamas. The Palestinian Authority is just as bad. We should stop, allowing their subsidies of terrorism, other things. Who cares if it collapses? And then others will say, wait a minute, we haven't figured out this Gaza problem. Why would we, quadruple that problem in something that's even more worrisome? So what's your sense of what happens, when he leaves the scene? And then what's your sense of what the Israeli reaction might be?
So I will say that the decision to ignore the looming succession crisis in the Palestinian Authority is probably the most consistent mistake, dare I call it an own goal, of the U.S. government. Our policy in the Middle East continues to, we get whiplash. We go from, slamming the Israelis over, settlement construction, generally speaking under Democrat administrations, to slamming the PA for pay for slay, for funding the families of convicted terrorists and things like that, when there is a very pragmatic approach that can and should be taken, and that is to begin to pave the way for Mahmoud Abbas's exit. Right now, there is no vice president. There is no succession plan. If you look back at what happened with the passing of Yasser Arafat, there was sort of almost like a papal conclave at the Muqata compound in Ramallah, where the PLO executive committee got together and chose Mahmoud Abbas as kind of the least common denominator, the guy that was just perhaps the least controversial of all the choices. And then from there, they promoted him as the likely Palestinian leader. He was then elected, and it was a very rigged process. We don't really have, I think, the luxury of going through that again. I don't think anybody on the Palestinian, in the West Bank in particular, wants to leave that up to the corrupt cronies of the PLO. And so there is very likely a crisis that is brewing. A very easy thing would be to force Abbas to identify a successor, or to identify a reliable process for elections in the West Bank only, because right now, again, if you had to go choose a leader and then you included the leaders from the Gaza Strip, you included Hamas, you'd be right back to the crisis that we were in back in April or the months leading up to April. So there are very clear things that can and should be done. I certainly would say that it's a major glaring kind of gap in U.S. policy, but it also is one on the Israeli side too. The Israelis, what they've done is they've basically bargained for the relative stability of Mahmoud Abbas while refusing to look at what might come after him. So there are certainly some candidates, and we could talk about some of the people that are involved in security or involved in the politics of the PLO that I think potentially could be names. There are also, former terrorists. For example, Marwan Barghouti is a name that's thrown around who's very popular and would likely win an election if Mahmoud Abbas were no longer sitting in that chair. But these are not all great options, right? What we really want is a system that's something that we can rely upon, that is predictable, and that will lead to long-term stability in the West Bank. And so it's been a glaring absence in U.S. foreign policy. It's one that, I blame both Democrats and Republicans for ignoring this looming crisis. But you're right, Abbas is 17 years into a 4-year term. He's corrupt. He lacks legitimacy. He's, I would say, thoroughly reviled by West Bankers and untrusted in the Gaza Strip. This is not the leadership that the Palestinians should have. By the way, I would also just note that the idea of even pursuing a two-state solution will not happen so long as he is in the chair. I think at this point, no one expects him to engage in a process like that, knowing that he's been something of a rejectionist, nonviolent. He's never launched an intifada. He's not supported violence openly against Israel, but this is a guy that is not interested in taking risks for his people.
So let's talk about let's turn to U.S. policy for a minute. So the war, we talk about China, Russia, Iran. In some ways, this war was like the first crisis that the Biden administration had to handle, and to a certain degree unexpected, even though for all the reasons you kind of lay out here in the book, you kind of wonder why it was a surprise, and a complicated one for them to handle too. There was no Israeli government. The administration was trying to figure out a way to at least park the Middle East while getting back into the Iran deal, which plays a big part in your book. What's your sense of how did the administration come out of the gate last year on these issues? Did the war change anything for them? What's your assessment of kind of how they handled it, and did it impact or at least had a lasting impact of what they've done after the fact? Because if I had to guess where we are today, a year into President Biden's term, is when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian issues, when it comes to Middle East issues writ large, my guess is they probably didn't think they'd be where they are now. They probably thought that they could move the needle on quite a number of things early on.
Yeah. So I would say that when it comes to the Biden administration's response during this war, there was the good, the bad, the worse, and the ugly. And I'll explain each of those briefly. The good was the support that the Biden administration provided to Israel in the first 9 days of those 11 days of war. They had Israel's back. The Israelis said so repeatedly. I mean, IDF officials, the Prime Minister's office, Foreign Ministry, everybody came out and said that the Biden administration was great. They deflected some of the initiatives against the Israelis at the UN, deflected even some of the calls from within the Democratic Party to go after the Israelis or to be tougher on them. But then comes the bad, and that's on the day that the Egyptian brokered ceasefire that I mentioned, when that was announced. We saw a marked shift in tone from the White House. In fact, there were a number of leaks that were coming out of the White House, very deliberate leaks, where reporters were hearing that Biden had told Bibi that he was, quote, done kidding around, end quote, and that he needed to end this war now, and that the Israelis were using disproportionate force. And as I saw that, that was a blank check provided by the Egyptians, where the White House knew that the war was going to end, and they used those 2 days to message to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I'm talking about those that wanted to zero out Iron Dome, those that wanted to cut off precision-guided munitions to Israel. We commonly refer to them as the Squad. After the war, I think some people started calling them the Hamas Caucus. Whatever the name is that you'd like to use for them, it was very clear to me that Biden was messaging to them. There was a kind of a domestic component to those last 2 days of the war here in the United States. And I would argue that, the good news is, of course, that Biden still had Israel's back throughout. The bad news is that there is this very open discussion going on about how to deal with Israel, which has traditionally been viewed, I think rightly, as a valued ally of the United States. And so here you have a very mainstream pragmatic president on foreign policy based on his track record in the past. And here he is sort of giving a nod to some of the most extreme voices within his party. And so I would say that's something to watch. It's something that I'm personally concerned about. And I think we'll have to wait and see where all of that leads. The bad, that was the bad. Then we get to the worst. The worst was the US decision in the first place to support those elections that I mentioned in the Palestinian Authority. I don't think we ever saw the Biden administration kind of own the error that they made there. I would say, though, that this was in fact something that the Biden administration was encouraging leading up to perhaps even the last week or two before it was canceled. I heard from a relatively senior Biden administration official that, hey, we are in no position after January 6th to tell other people how to vote, when to vote, who can take part in their elections. Our democracy is flawed, so how can we tell them what to do? I'm sorry, we have laws about Hamas participation. We've got foreign terrorist organization lists. We've got sanctions lists at the US Treasury. We have policy. And the ignoring of that policy, I think, certainly led to the outbreak of the war in part. And I think the Biden administration never quite reconciled with that. I think that was a problem. The last thing that I'll just say about the Biden administration's policy during and after was this question of Iran. And this, I think, is probably the most consequential. Leading up to the war, we saw the United States aggressively pursue a return to the Iran nuclear deal, the 2015 deal, otherwise known as the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This was, it was controversial, to put it mildly. Of course, former President Trump's decision to exit that deal without a backup plan was also controversial. But I think the very fact that there was this sort of seesaw going on probably reflected the fact that the US public and perhaps even our political class is still not 100% sure about what to do with the Iran problem. But we are very aware of the fact that Iran is the foremost state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and that Iran has given hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas over the years. So during the war, we know this for sure, Hamas was getting openly cheered on by the Iranians. The Iranian fingerprints were all over the weapons. I'm talking about the rockets and the missiles and the underwater drones and the aerial drones and the tunnels and everything else that Hamas used, all the weaponry that they had at their disposal. It was gifted to them by Iran over the years. They were trained, they were funded by Iran. And the amazing thing was that here you have the United States trying to end this conflict, and yet it does not stop trying to get back into another Iran deal that would yield the Iranians tens of billions, if not more than $100 billion in sanctions relief. So in other words, what the US is still trying to do is to effectively become an indirect funder of Iran's proxies on the one hand, while also supporting Israel on the other. I've never seen anything like this in our time since maybe the Iran-Iraq war, where we are literally thinking about funding both sides of a conflict. And if in fact we get back into the deal, and there is every indication that this is what the Biden administration wants, we will be in that very awkward place where we'll be funding the Israelis on the one side, providing them with significant military assistance, and on the other hand, we'll be providing Iran with massive sanctions relief that will undoubtedly, as we have seen in the past, flow to groups like Hamas.
So this dynamic, in some ways, is kind of cognitive dissonance almost, in that way. This is also at play during the Obama administration, during the negotiation of the interim agreement and the original Iran deal. And the president at the time, at least publicly, would say, there's no reason we can't push back on all of Iran's activity in the region, Hamas, Hezbollah, in Syria and Iraq, and so forth. Now, they didn't really do much with it. Do you think that the current administration, given that the president himself, obviously, the Secretary of State, and so many others are basically alums of the previous administration, do you think they learned any lessons from that experience? Do you see them acting differently than where we were 5 or 6 years ago?
I don't. In fact, I see a willful blindness to the dynamics of the last round. In other words, one of the things that we heard was that they were going to track all of the funds and make sure that money wasn't going to flow into the coffers of various terrorist proxies that Iran supports. First of all, we provided a huge amount of cash, pallets of cash, as we all now know. There is no way to track that cash. There is no way that you can identify where all that cash goes. And so that was a huge problem. I don't know whether cash would be part of a future deal or not, but certainly I think that is, at least in part, Iran's preference. But we were also able to identify, and this I heard from various Obama era officials, that money was flowing to some of these proxy groups, despite the promises, despite the statements otherwise. We know that it was happening. And so, I don't think we've heard anything from, as you call them, the alums of the Obama years that are now pursuing a renewed Iran nuclear deal. We haven't heard about the mechanisms that they would put in place to halt the flow of these funds, to stop the support of the various terrorist organizations. There's been actually very little said about this. The Israelis, by the way, have been, I think, very careful not to let this creep into the discussions, because then I think their fear is that, okay, well, you get promises on that, but then you have to make concessions on the nuclear side. They're trying not to muddy the water, but they see things very clearly, that this is buying off the Iranian regime to try to slow, not end, but to slow its nuclear progress, and that there's really nothing else that we're going to hold them accountable on, which is highly problematic. And I think it was clear to me that it was being ignored deliberately during the May war of last year, that this dynamic of Iran providing funds, providing training, providing the engineering support, all of this that we know has been going on for decades, was just simply shrugged off by the administration, and they focused on the tactical goal of just bringing an end to the conflict, bringing stability back to the region. And again, I think that is, just simply not enough.
I will say, just to push back a little bit, it seems like the one lesson they have learned is that whatever tension or disputes that our government is going to have with the Israeli government, that they're better off trying to actually keep it behind closed doors. It seemed to be that during the Obama years, it wasn't just that they failed at preventing these things from going out, is that they would often go out of their way thinking that they actually could bring public pressure to bear to get the Israeli government to change their position. And maybe it's a domestic political calculus, I don't know, but it seemed, or maybe President Biden just feels differently about the issue than President Obama did. But it seems like there's a shift. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
No, there is a shift. It's without a doubt. I would say that since the Biden administration has come in, there's been a very determined effort to try to avoid the kinds of food fights that we saw between Obama and Bibi. They were sort of notorious, brawlers at the time. They were sort of Tom and Jerry, or I don't know, Roadrunner and the Coyote or something. They're constantly, beating each other over the head. So the Biden administration comes in, and they're just actually, for the first several months, tried not to even have conversations with Bibi, didn't want to have that kind of reckoning, if you will, knowing that he was probably going to come after them for what he viewed, I think, rather correctly as a flawed policy. I think what's interesting now is that since Bibi has gone in the almost immediate aftermath of the Gaza war of last year, you have this new leadership in place in Israel, where Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid are actually very keen to also avoid that conflict. I think they understand that there needed to be some kind of a reset with the US government, that the path that Bibi had put Israel on, both in his very vociferous opposition to Obama policies, and also his very close relationship with the controversial president of Donald Trump. Both of those things, I think, prompted Bennett and Lapid to realize that a reset was necessary. So they're trying to reset. I think they're doing a good job of establishing a baseline. And by the way, that baseline extends well beyond sort of Israel's core national security needs and the Iran deal, but also, is venturing into areas like China and Russia, and even the environment, which is kind of a new thing I haven't quite seen that in the past, where you see heightened cooperation between the White House and Israel on things like that. So they're working hard to reset the relationship. But I have to say that I still believe that the dynamic of trying to enter back into the Iran deal and to provide all of the sanctions relief to the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, that, by the way, has not disavowed its nuclear program at all. I think raises a lot of questions about what the United States is asking Israel to do and what Israel is going to get in return. It doesn't look equitable to me, and I can imagine that it will not end well. But again, how they navigate this, I think, will be important. They have lowered the temperature, and I think that has allowed for a more sober conversation to take place.
So let's talk about another regional dynamic. So the May 2021 war, as you put in, as you've covered in your career, was the fourth Gaza war in 15 years. It was also the first one since the advent of the Abraham Accords, where 4 Arab states normalized relations, made peace with the state of Israel, less than 6 months before this, or so, 8 months or so before the war occurring. And it's sort of that development kind of flew in the face of a lot of arguments, not just in the Arab world, even within Israel, and especially within the United States, that there's no way that other Arab states beyond Egypt and Jordan would make peace with Israel absent first the establishment of a Palestinian state or some major progress. Most famously, former Secretary of State John Kerry, when he was kind of took over kind of lead negotiations in the middle of the Obama years, kind of just vociferously kind of like berated anybody who would think otherwise. So it flew in the face of that. What's your sense of how the war impacted those developing relations? Because on the one hand, I think today the Israeli defense minister is in Bahrain, for example. On the one hand, the accords with those countries have, especially the UAE and Bahrain, have just kind of like, flown, just on everything. On the other hand, there was sort of an expectation that there might be 1 or 2, maybe 3 other Arab states that might join. And that hasn't happened either. So what's your sense about how the war, maybe its other dynamics, has changed that development?
Well, first, I'll just say that I think the lack of new partners in the Abraham Accords, or for maybe add-on normalization agreements, I actually believe that's the direct result of a deprioritization of the process on the part of this White House. I think it's become something of a political football, which is unfortunate. But you had the Trump administration claiming this as one of its signature successes, and so I think there's a reluctance on the part of this White House to acknowledge those successes and to build on them. They're not actively. I mean, to be fair, they're not trying to actively unravel the agreements that were struck, but you don't see them trying to build on them either. It's been a sort of a muted process, and I think a bit of a curious one. A similar sort of approach would be, if you think about it historically, that if Reagan came in after Carter brokered peace between Egypt and Israel, and then began to downplay that relationship or to discourage it, or to discourage additional peace agreements, you'd scratch your head. This is sort of where we are right now, and I think it's certainly worth exploring a bit more. Maybe not for this conversation, but it's an odd dynamic that you don't see in kind of an active pursuit of follow-on agreements and sort of an open attempt to encourage more of this. It just seems like we're on autopilot, which to me strikes me as it's just very odd, given that I think there still is some hunger in the region. There's some real curiosity on the part of other states in the region. I don't mean Iraq or Lebanon or Algeria, but Oman, maybe Kuwait, certainly Saudi Arabia. There are Muslim countries in the Far East that are openly mulling this. There are countries in Africa, North Africa and Saharan Africa that are considering this. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. Now, as for the war itself, I considered it to be a stress test for the 4 agreements that you mentioned. Here you have Arab populations that may have, I think, decided in signing the agreements that they were, they weren't going to let the Palestinian issue dictate their foreign policy priorities. That if they saw a need to partner with the Israelis in terms of security or intelligence or economics, whatever it is, that the Palestinians shouldn't have a veto. And ultimately, I think that is the prevailing message that everybody got from the region as a result of the Abraham Accords. But then comes the war, and they are watching on TV as Arabs, Muslims, are on the receiving end of a bombing campaign from Israel. Of course, I think most of them recognize that Israel didn't initiate this, that Israel didn't want it, but that it was a response. Still, the response was overwhelming, and it was causing suffering to the people of the Gaza Strip. There can be no doubt that that was the case. And so I think there was a moment where emotions were flaring, tensions were high, and we even saw some hashtags that were kind of circulating on Twitter: Jerusalem is my cause, support the Palestinians, things like that. But what was interesting is, we saw a very muted response from the Arab states themselves. In fact, in some cases, you saw them actively trying to diffuse some of the tensions online, engaging with those that were trying to circulate these hashtags, coming up with kind of competing hashtags. Jerusalem is not our cause, things like that. And it was really interesting to see this play out. Another thing that I'll just note is, apart from Al Jazeera, which is known for its vitriol, there were a number of Arab channels that I watched during the war where, it used to be that you would see the war on like 24/7 images coming out of the Gaza Strip. That was not the case this time around. It would be top of the hour news, and then they'd go on to sports and weather and economy and things like that. So you got a sense that the Arab public was not being fed this steady diet of hate, which I think also it's an editorial decision that was taken by a lot of these Arab regimes. So at the end of the day, I think that everybody passed the stress test. They were able to get through to the other side of this conflict without having the agreements scuttled. They weren't quit. They stayed intact. And now you actually see that the Israelis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, they're building on the fact that this thing stood the test of time. You can see them developing warmer ties, better ties as a result. Now, Morocco is still, I don't know, let's just say it's lukewarm. And Sudan is kind of a mess right now politically. And so I wouldn't expect to see a whole lot moving in that direction. But it's really interesting to see that they were able to get through to the other side of it, and they went right back to business after the war was over. I think that is an excellent sign of maybe what we can expect in the future.
So we talked about Iran. We talked about, if you will, the Gulf states. Let's talk about Turkey for a minute too, because that's sort of the other kind of missing piece of the kind of regional powers, let's say. On the one hand, under this Turkish president, former prime minister, has been in power for almost 20 years, has taken the country in another direction in a variety of ways, given safe haven to Hamas leaders and beyond. And in the book, I think you actually document quite a lot of inflammatory rhetoric, to be diplomatic about it, from the Turkish president. On the other hand, over the last year, and it seems to be, or my read of it, I'll curious yours, mostly because of internal dynamics, President Erdogan has seemed to try and make a rapprochement with not only Israel and the UAE, to a certain degree the United States, and other powers on this side. And we'll see what the stress test of that is as to where it goes and how it happens. What's your read of where Turkey is heading at the moment? Is it the Turkey that we saw, during the war, 9 months ago, with just kind of rhetoric that seemed to be just kind of copied from the Hamas script? Or is it the one more recently that seems to realize that, if it is continuously on the side of the Islamists or the revolutionaries, that, it's not going to have a lot of friends?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it's just worth noting for a second that, first, Turkey has become a significant jurisdiction for Hamas operations, probably the second largest in the world after the Gaza Strip. In fact, the 2014 war, the last Gaza war, was actually sparked by a guy named Saleh Haruri, who was based in Turkey, and he was the one who planned and financed and ultimately directed the kidnapping and killing of those 3 teens in the West Bank, and that ultimately that sparked the 2014 conflict. But on top of that, I mean, the Turks have been involved in sanctions busting on behalf of the Iranian regime, $20 billion of illicit finance. And that's a court case that's actually still winding its way through the US courts right now, where a major Turkish bank that is connected to the Turkish government could go down. And then on top of that, you've got support for ISIS that happened, where fighters were being allowed to very openly travel across Turkey and enter into northern Syria to fight with the Islamic State. So we see all of this stuff that's been going on, and now a sudden about face. And I think we need to identify this, that it really does seem out of character for Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey. I don't trust it. I'd welcome it if he were to dial back on all of this radical activity, anti-Western, anti-American, anti-Israel, in fact, in many ways, anti-Semitic activity. We've seen this. This has been a hallmark of his since he came to power in the early 2000s. It's just steadily gotten worse over time. So look, I think it'd be great if he does make an about face and align more with NATO, align more with the United States, and dial back on this kind of nasty rhetoric with Israel. And by the way, also dial back on the actions and the financing of some of these groups that are anathema to Western values. So but the question is what's motivating him and why. My fear is that he's doing this for short-term reasons and short-term gain, not for a long-term commitment to Western values, not to a long-term commitment to an alliance with the United States, or a commitment to keeping things more calm and stable with Israel. We have seen some reports that he's gone to an Israeli doctor for medical reasons, and that perhaps that was part of a deal, that if he wanted to get the treatment that he needed and he's been, by the way, rumored to have cancer in the past and things like that maybe he needed to do this as part of a deal that was struck. That, I have to say, is it's conjecture. We don't know. But overall, his track record is troubling, and he, until now, has not been a leader that really anybody can trust.
Were you surprised that that the war seemed to not change that trajectory? I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is, and again, going around the region, which is, the war didn't change, the Biden administration's, Iran policy broadly, or certainly kind of Iran's goals and activities. The Abraham Accords passed the stress test, and if anything, passed it with flying colors. To your point about, like, especially Bahrain and UAE just kind of really kind of taken off. Relations with the Palestinian Authority, between Israel and Palestinian Authority, haven't changed that dramatically, let's call it. And Turkey is the only thing, and to your point, it's probably not because of the war, but maybe there's a little bit of a shift, but you're skeptical of it. Is it interesting to you that this war is actually not really shaken up the region, whereas just a couple of years ago in a prior iteration, it very well might have? Or is this is it your analysis more that, like, this is the reduction or the sort of containment, let's say, of a conflict that just a short number of years ago could have really exploded the region?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that there have been moments where we've seen conflicts on the Palestinian-Israeli front that really do rock the region. I would also, though, say that the last number of conflicts, maybe even you could probably argue all four, didn't change much in terms of the overall dynamic in the region. I think there is despite all the outrage that it produces, with predictable partisan shots flying from both sides, people taking the Israeli side or the Palestinian side in the media, the angry tweets and everything else that goes on. I think people understand that this is a tactical issue. This is not a strategic or existential issue, not for the Israelis, not for Hamas. Israelis want to go back into the Gaza Strip. They don't want to control the territory any longer. They don't even want to have a war there. They don't see any strategic need for doing so. So these are tactical battles. The Israelis want to get in, neutralize, get out. That's what they do. I think it's now beginning to seep into the region that that's what this is, and it's an opportunity for people to sound off. But I don't think that it changes the dynamic in any significant way. And that's sort of one of the reasons why I just found the hyperbolic rhetoric that came out of the West and some of the poor reporting that came out of the West so shocking. These things are incredibly predictable, right? Israel right now is watching Hamas amass rockets. They're building that target bank that I mentioned. Then there will be some kind of provocation. Hamas will start firing rockets again. There may be a few surprises. Israel will neutralize most of them. and they will hit all of the pre-approved targets on the ground, and then probably another 10 or 15% for good measure that will be based on real-time assessments of threat. At some point, a ceasefire will be reached, probably brokered by Egypt or some other regional power. The United States will take credit for it. Things will calm back down, but things will not be solved. And then Hamas will begin to amass those rockets again. It is all utterly predictable. And I think my sense anyway is that the region is beginning to understand this. I'm not sure that's how it's perceived here in the West, which is just a bit silly from my perspective. The only other thing that I'll just note about this is that, maybe what was most significant was that this war took place under the shadow of indications and statements from the United States that we are getting out of the Middle East, right? It happened as we were preparing to get out of Afghanistan, as we've talked about drawing down troops across the region, that we want to pivot to Asia. What's really remarkable to me is that if we're going to do that, we are going to have to leave the region in the hands of responsible actors. And I think that if you're looking for those that align themselves with the United States, are willing to fight for the American-led world order, that are looking to keep things effectively the way they are, to maintain sort of structure in the region, then you need the Israelis and perhaps the Emiratis, maybe the Saudis, a couple of other Gulf states, and they should be the regional leaders. It was not clear to me at the end of this war that the United States was ready to hand over the baton and to say, guys, we're leaving. Good job keeping everything in order. That doesn't seem to be the message coming out of the US. In fact, what we saw afterwards that was the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan that I think sent shockwaves through the region, and certainly has, I think, Israel and some of its Gulf allies scratching their head, wondering what they're going to do with this region after the United States potentially leaves it worse than we found it.
So let me ask one kind of wild card question, and then I think we probably have time for one or maybe two questions from the audience. So the way you kind of describe the Hamas-Israel dynamics, a little bit rinse and repeat. And sure, there's some technological developments. Hamas develops rockets and missiles, Israel develops missile defense, Hamas develops tunnels, Israel develops tunnel defense. Now we're talking about kind of UAVs and precision guided munitions rather in the hands of people that we wouldn't have expected just a couple of years ago. But the big question mark in my mind is sort of what does Hezbollah do, which is a word that I don't think we've used in this hour, right? It's a border, a terrain for both size and topographical regions that's actually a lot harder to seal off and defend for the Israelis than Gaza is. It is much more directly controlled by the Iranians than Hamas is. It has access to far bigger resources, far more advanced. I mean, all these things. What is your sense of the next flare up, because inevitably there will be one on Gaza? What makes the determination of whether Hezbollah joins in and there's a second front versus not?
So I have a whole chapter on this in the book. And what was really interesting to me was that there were 6 rockets, I believe, that were fired out of Lebanon during the Gaza war. Most of them, I think, hit the Mediterranean or didn't actually, none of them hit anything of value in Israel. Israel responded with some, half-hearted artillery fire in the direction of where the rockets came from. And that was kind of the end of it for Israel. But what I am watching and what I'm concerned about is that there have been reports actually dating back to 2018. Danny Danon, who was the former Israeli ambassador to the UN, submitted a letter warning that Hamas was trying to create rocket infrastructure in Lebanon with the explicit goal of drawing Israel into a two-front war in the future. At the time during the war, the rockets were blamed on, kind of random Palestinian refugee groups that were firing rockets in purported solidarity with Hamas. But I think, now digging just a bit deeper, I think there is a real chance that Hamas does have that infrastructure in place, that maybe those 6 rockets were tests for a future war. And so this will be something that we'll have to watch, because a two-front war is a very different animal for Israel in the future. It's not just that, Israel might have to fend off a couple of rocket attacks by Hamas that, where they've got rockets ensconced in the mountains in the Bekaa Valley or something. There is the possibility that Hezbollah feels the need to defend Lebanese sovereignty, if you will, and the prospect of a war with Hezbollah is a much more daunting scenario, given that they have 150,000 rockets as opposed to 15,000. So they've got 10 times as many rockets as Hamas has. But also, and I think as you mentioned, they have precision-guided munitions provided by Iran. This means that they could potentially evade Iron Dome. It means that they could potentially hit high-value targets by overwhelming Iron Dome. And certainly the precision of those high-value of those rockets and hitting high-value targets is what has the Israelis worried most. I mean, if you can accurately strike the Dimona nuclear facility, or you can accurately strike the chemical plant in Haifa, or if you could accurately strike the Azrieli towers in Tel Aviv, you could create a catastrophic attack. And so this is what I think Israeli war planners are worried about in the north. It's something to continue to watch. The only thing that I'll say that is probably the greatest insurance against Hezbollah joining the fray is that the country's bankrupt and it's in complete chaos right now, right? I mean, it's politically, it's collapsed. Economically, it's in a massive amount of debt. I think a conservative estimate is $120 billion in debt right now. It cannot afford a devastating war. It cannot afford an effort to rebuild. And so if Hezbollah is aware of this, and undoubtedly it is, that may prompt the group to think twice.
Gotcha. All right. Well, so I think we have time for one question. So Ethan Edwards, I'm going to you. Why don't you introduce yourself and ask your question?
All right. Hi, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Yes.
All right. Hi. So yeah, my name is Ethan Edwards. I am technically an AHS alum from the Ohio State chapter. I'm currently interning with the U.S. Trade Representatives, and I'm going to the CIR program at the University of Chicago. My question was, it seems to me that Hamas is not going anywhere anytime soon, and that they're the main impediment to any agreement within at least Gaza and Israel. So my question is, what do you think will happen? Like, what would Hamas's ultimate fate be? And what role do you think Israel would play in that process?
Look, I think that as of right now, it's a good question, Ethan. So thank you. I think right now Hamas is not going anywhere, but its power can be diminished, and I think there's just an open question about whether that's the policy that the U.S. and its allies want to take. And by that, I mean depriving its primary patrons of support and legitimacy so long as they engage in, the kind of military and political and diplomatic and financial support that we've seen. So Iran being a big one. I think the Iran nuclear deal will have a significant amount of influence on the trajectory of Hamas. The same goes for Turkey, and Gabe mentioned the role that Turkey plays. As long as we treat Turkey like a legitimate NATO ally while it's engaging in this kind of support for Hamas, I think we've got a huge problem. The Qataris, I got huge, concerns about the recent announcement by the Biden administration that we're going to recognize the Qataris as a major non-NATO ally when they are among the top financial patrons of Hamas in the world. They allow for a lot of Hamas operatives to have established their headquarters in Doha, and it's an ongoing problem. By the way, I mean, the Qataris are the ATM for a wide array of other terrorist groups as well. Even Malaysia, by the way, and we didn't talk about them at all today, but the Malaysians also have provided a lot of support for students that are studying engineering and want to apply their skills to Hamas weaponry. This has been actually the spot of a number of suspected Mossad assassinations of Hamas activists that have been based there. But so, I think you're right that as long as we don't have efforts underway to weaken the funders and supporters of Hamas, then yeah, Israel's going to have to deal with them. Then I think the question becomes, can you tried to engineer some kind of national dialogue within the Palestinian Authority. And this is something, by the way, that's been raised by Salam Fayyad, the former prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, where he's talked about how a national dialogue, a national discussion that allows the Palestinians to come to an understanding about the role of terrorism in their political discourse and in their society, the role of violence, the role of jihadism, the role of Islamism, that until these things are ironed out, it will be impossible to hold elections, and the people of the Palestinian territories are going to be divided and, quite frankly, miserable as a result. So there may be an opportunity, getting back to one of your questions, Gabe, about succession and about Mahmoud Abbas. It's possible that after Mahmoud Abbas leaves the scene, likely feet first from the Muqata, but when he does leave the scene, there could be an opportunity with new leadership to begin a discussion along these lines and to begin to disarm Hamas and to begin to reintegrate the Gaza Strip. Right now, it's impossible, right? You can't do it with the two actors that we have, but it should be a goal of ours in the future.
I'll take that ending on which sounds like a slightly optimistic note, because I think so much of the problems are enduring, and sort of my takeaway from your work, from the book, but even the regional dynamics, which is that as bad as we can kind of run through the list, as many things are, to your point, is that the war didn't dramatically change a lot of those dynamics. You hope that they would change the negative ones, but even the positive ones, like the Abraham Accords, like the creation of this kind of broad Israeli government that seems to be holding, like the relationship between Israel and the United States. I mean, a lot of these things held, which I think is a positive view as well.
Correct. Absolutely.
So thank you, Jonathan Schanzer. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Hope everybody gets a chance to read the book, Gaza Conflict 2021, and hope everybody has a wonderful day.